Hello and welcome to another episode of Profiles in OSINT, an interview series by District 4 Labs where we sit down with experts in the industry to discuss how they got to where they are today. My name is Albie Giandomenico, and today I'm joined by Rachel Robinson. Rachel is the Senior Director in Investigations and Director of Research at Prescient. So Rachel, just to start off so our viewers have more context, could you describe a little bit more about your background and how you got to where you are in the industry today?
Yeah, totally separate things. No one has a degree in private investigations, I don't think. And I didn't come through law enforcement, which is how a lot of my colleagues show up here. My degree is in theater. I was a stage manager for almost 10 years and got to a point where I realized I didn't like doing it. And it's a lot of work and no money to do something you don't like. So I temped a lot, and because my resume was getting me nowhere for office jobs, I temped a lot, treated every job like an apprenticeship. And one of the places I temped frequently was a place called Kroll, and they kind of were one of the earliest and largest firms in this kind of corporate private investigations. And I told them they should hire me as a part-time admin, and they said, "We don't need that, but we need an analyst. Do you want to take the test?" And I said, "Yeah, what else am I doing with my life?" And I did, and it turned out that I can logic my way through a lot of problems and take direction well when somebody says, "You know what I like to do is," and it ended up being something I really liked. I like being professionally nosy.
You didn't have to act like you liked it.
No, and I was never an actor. As a stage manager, all of the soft skills transferred. The writing a little report frequently about what happened and what we learned today, the general diplomacy, the learning about a new topic all the time, becoming an expert temporarily and then forgetting it while you move on to the next thing, and it's all the same. All those things transferred.
Makes sense. And tell us a little bit more about Prescient, sort of what services are offered by Prescient.
So a lot. So Prescient has 4 general practices, which each offer different, sometimes overlapping services. My practice is called Investigations, and I'm sure we'll get back to it. We'll answer a specific question or get you more information to make a decision. Due diligence, which is how kind of I started in this industry way back at Kroll. They will answer the question, is this person going to be a good or a bad investment, right? And we'll talk about what happens when you don't do that. Intel, which will give you a lot of general information about an industry or a competitor or a place that you might be traveling to on business, or help provide protection for you. And cyber, which also has a monitoring component. So cyber will do things reactively, like respond to incidents like breaches or ransomware attacks. Will do things proactively, like create a plan for you to protect yourself or your company digitally so that you're not exposed. And monitoring will help after that to say, hey, there is a threat out there. I think that pretty much covers it.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good to me. And what sort of differentiates Prescient from maybe similar companies within the space?
What I really like, having worked in a couple other places, is that we are big enough to have good resources and good connections and get things done, and small enough that if something weird comes, we can create a process for it. I can create a new kind of investigation. I don't have to go through 3 layers of permissions to do it.
So you mentioned having a pretty unorthodox way to enter the industry, for lack of a better way to put it. What were some things that you wish you could have known maybe when you were in college or starting to enter the professional world that would have helped you out in finding what you actually like to do? Things about the OSINT industry or even just investigations that you wish you knew when you were younger.
Like I said, a lot of my colleagues are former law enforcement. A lot are attorneys. They were prosecutors, most of them. If I had known when I was in college that I could get a law degree or probably never even pass the bar, but get a law degree and do this kind of professional nosiness of being an investigator without ever carrying a weapon like a detective would, that I knew about then. I might have done it because it would have never occurred to me that, spending an entire childhood being told that curiosity killed the cat could lead to something. It could lead to something that I like doing. My dream jobs as a kid were archaeologist and librarian, and I feel like I'm doing a lot of that. So that would have been good. I don't mind that I had a career before this. I think it's made me really adaptable. I think that I know that having had a million part-time jobs and having a little bit of understanding of a million industries has helped me figure out what should this company look like, and it doesn't. So where do I find the gap in that?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess you started to talk a bit about bringing a lot of different experiences together and putting them all into one here with this opportunity. But is that something that you really like about the industry, the fact that you do have to have all of these different skills and bring them all together? What are some things that you really enjoy about it?
Oh, I love doing something new all the time. If I'm doing the same thing for more than a few months, I'm looking for something else to do. And I love that I don't have to change jobs to do that. Yeah, and I like working with interesting and smart people, which is 99% of the time true. I love working with people that can tell me war stories about their prior career or their dumb investigations, smart investigations of dumb people. And so I love that it's different every day. I love that I have to figure something out. I mean, sometimes in the moment, do I love that I don't know what to do? Yeah, I kind of hate it sometimes. And then I figure it out and I run up and down the hall celebrating myself. Yeah. And I love working with people who will do that for each other because we all go through that. We'll all hype each other up.
Yeah, and I've heard you sort of talk about the industry in general beforehand, and you've given talks at different webinars, and even I've heard at a kid's school not too long ago. So would you mind going into that a little bit and just going through how you sort of explain things to people whenever you are, whether it's kids or adults in the industry?
Yeah. So, explaining what I do to kids. I don't know that I successfully got there because I saw their interest drain away as soon as I said, I don't follow people around to find out if they're cheating on their spouses. I don't do surveillance, really. They all wanted to know how much I make, and I was not willing to tell them exactly, but, So I like to say that, I talked a little bit about who I work with, lawyers and law enforcement and businesses. And I like to say that my job, especially in investigations, but really in any of these practices or roles, is to either answer a specific question or provide more information to make a decision. And I will use a lot of tools to do that, right? So when I started, what I did was called a public records investigation. Now it's kind of rolled into OSINT, but there are people that specialize in one end or the other of that kind of spectrum of online records and traditional public records, which are usually online. So I'll use property records to answer questions about who knows who, or phone records, or lots of newspapers and magazines. When you were a kid, you probably showed up in a newspaper about graduating from 8th grade or something. I can help answer questions and find out where people have been and who they know, right, with things like that. Court records. A lot of what's available generally is also online. So I'm just working from my home or from my office at a computer. And then a lot of online records. So I call it reverse doxing. You know who the person is. Are they posting about their job online? I'll go try and figure that out, try and figure out their username and where they're using things. And so in all of those, I might be using primary sources or I might be using secondary sources, which in our business are usually called commercial databases. And for this is what I did not explain to children because they don't have credit records. So the basic commercial databases that all private investigators use are providing identity information. And they're coming from a lot of sources, some of them what we would call public sources, and some of them from the top part. It used to be, you used to get a clipboard to fill out anytime you wanted credit for anything, including for like your cell phone plan. Now it's the first page of a form online. All of that biographical information about yourself, not how much money you make, not who you owe, but that kind of, here's where I live, here's my phone number, maybe here's who I work for. That gets sold to a lot of different vendors who resell it, and some of them repackage it into these kind of comprehensive reports, or there are other ways you can search them. So my sources, my ability to gather data is wide, and it's my job to make it into information.
And so you talked about data, and essentially we discussed beforehand that data is, a very big part of the industry, and especially just in terms of trends, there's so much data out there. How do you go about finding out which data sources you put more credibility in versus the ones that you're wary about?
I say all the time the databases lie, which is sort of true. They answer a specific question that I'm going to use to answer another specific question. But they answer a specific question. You have to be very careful about the question you're asking them and make sure that what you think you're asking them is what they think they're answering. And so I put a lot of emphasis in my own work and when I'm teaching others in clicking that little question mark box, or sometimes it's a little I, that tells you what exactly is in there. And I want as close to primary records as I can. I want it to be verifiable in another way, right? Because I'm very cautious about screwing up someone's life because I gave the wrong information. I relied on the wrong thing. I misinterpreted something. Like, still keeps me up at night 12 years later. So I like when I can tell exactly where things came from and think about to myself, well, this was entered by, this kind of information is usually entered by customer service reps. And I think about the dumbest customer service rep I've ever talked to on the phone, and that they probably, something they typed has ended up in one of these. It's like, is that reliable? Maybe if I can find another thing that says the same thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So how do you see data sources changing, especially recently? Are there any new different types of data sources that you look for in particular, or?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. One is that as I get farther and farther away from a traditional corporate due diligence search, which usually involves investigations of executives of companies, right? Or people who have started companies, so they have an established history in the public record system. The more I move away from that, the more I get into people who don't have what you would consider a traditional credit history. When I'm looking at possible recruits for a baseball team, they're 18, 19, they don't have a credit history. They don't have homes. They probably don't even pay for their phone, right? Or if I'm looking at somebody who has had kind of a chaotic life and is known to police and maybe is presenting a possible threat to my client, they won't have that same kind of public records footprint. So there are a couple of things. In the past, I would have used a lot of tricks on Facebook. It was a lot more open when I started. There were a lot of tricks where I could get to see profiles that were sort of private. Those are gone, right? And searching it is harder. And so finding out what people put out about themselves is different. So there's a couple of things I use. I rely a lot on transforms in Maltego that can search for profiles directly with identifiers that I give them. And then I use a lot Darkside in Maltego, which has these breached credential records. So somebody with a traditional credit profile, maybe I don't find them in the traditional databases, but I do see them in a record that was breached from a payday loan lead generator. It's not generally the payday loan company itself, but the lead generator. So people have put in information about where they live and who they work for in there, or their phone numbers. And then I can take that phone number and look for it in a bunch of different ways. So once again, there's more data than ever, but it's my job to make it into information that's actionable in some way, which a lot of times the action is do nothing, which is fine.
Still helpful.
That's fine. It helps. It makes people comfortable. But so that's a lot of how things have changed. I really enjoy it. I love knowing more about a person in different ways. I love telling the story. Like, I'm still a little bit of a theater magician at heart. I love telling the story, putting together the story, finding out the story, thinking about what would motivate this person, what would be normal for them to do, is this out of character for them? And you can find that in the things people do, and you can find that in the things people say, which are two different kinds of records.
Yeah, it's all one big puzzle, and there are a whole bunch of pieces, but you just have to figure out how to put them together.
Yeah, and to make them make sense, or to find out where there is missing information, because that's fine too sometimes.
And you mentioned finding a lot of that missing information sometimes within the breached records at Darkside. Well, let's talk about a few different maybe cases or examples that you've found to be especially interesting, and obviously completely anonymized, but would love to hear a little bit more about anything that sort of piques your interest.
Sure. So this was, I think, last summer. We had a case where we were trying to find out more information about someone who attacked our client physically. And I went through that attacker's Facebook profile, which I found pretty easily. But I was looking at the reviews he'd given, and he'd only given a couple. I knew he was at bars every weekend. I could see that between his Facebook and his Instagram. But he'd only left a couple of reviews, and one of them was recent, and it was a negative review of a bar, and it specifically called out a bartender for throwing him out. And I looked at that bar, and it didn't have a lot of reviews until he posted that one, and then there were like a dozen from other people saying, "We love this bartender. She makes everyone feel safe." And I thought, this is something. So I went through the bar's Facebook, figured out who this bartender was from her first name. She doesn't use her real name on Facebook because she's a popular bartender, and I get it. And I thought, well, I can go through and socially engineer and figure out who she's talking to a lot, and maybe figure out if they're relatives, and then figure out her name, because I needed to contact her, and I didn't want to do it through Facebook. And what am I going to do? And I thought, oh, I wonder if her Facebook information has ever been in a breach. So I took the user ID and maybe even her user name from Facebook and ran it. And sure enough, it was in there. I got a good email, a good phone number in 10 minutes, which could have been a half-day project. We called her, and she said, oh, yeah, I did throw him out because he was attacking people just like your client had been attacked. And it was 6 weeks earlier. And she said, and this was my friend. And we called the friend, and he said, yeah, I even put in a police report. So we had a documented paper trail. This was part of a pattern. Mm-hmm. That was really helpful. If we hadn't moved fast on it, it would have been less of a fresh lead and more of a problem.
You mentioned that action isn't always taken on the information they give people, but when it really is, it's got to feel a little bit more rewarding too.
Yeah, and there were real world consequences that were beneficial to our client, right? Which is, it's good to hear. It's not like a fight between a CFO and his company, and both did each other wrong.
Yeah, or a domestic dispute.
Yeah, I try not to get involved in those.
Exactly. Do you want to talk about the ducks.org one too? All right.
And then there was another one, which I've actually used a couple of times. So a lot of what I do are what we call threat investigation.
Yeah.
So especially a workplace violence incident, we know from research that there's like a pretty predictable pathway to violence. It starts with, saying stuff and ends up with doing bad things. And if you can interrupt it somewhere in that path, you can prevent a workplace incident. So I come in to try and find out more information about the person to see how likely this threat is, where they are on the pathway to violence. Are they making public statements? Is there evidence that they've been creeping around, looking for ways to get in, stuff like that? And one of the basic questions I'm trying to answer most of the time is, does this person have a gun? And surprisingly, in the US, there's no public registry of gun ownership or being licensed to have or carry one. So it's not as easy as searching a database or a government website. And one of the places that I find to answer that question, besides like bankruptcy records, or people always post pictures of themselves with guns online, if they're not that kind of person, where I've found it multiple times is ducks.org, which is the website of a hunting group, right? A nonprofit that is for hunters and about preserving land, right? They've had a breach, and I will find sometimes that people have registered for hunting competitions that are hosted or organized by ducks.org. And I don't know that I would have noticed the record. It would have stood out the first time, except that like I was raised by PBS, and the Duck Foundation sponsored a lot of public programming. But I did, and I saw in there, sure enough, this person registered for a hunt in this year, which at the time is pretty recent. So not only am I reasonably sure they have a gun for hunting, I'm reasonably sure that they at least think that they're good enough to compete, which is useful and actionable information.
Awesome. And we're always looking for, more data sources. We want to highlight things that have helped out before. So what are some other data sources that you use and you found to be very complementary to things like breached records with Darkside? What's sort of the general smattering of OSINT sources?
Sure. I mean, so if I discover information in one place, I can feed it into the other, right? And it's an iterative process, building out my corkboard full of papers and red strings, which is digital now and not an actual one. So I'll back and forth, build in using Shadow Dragon, SocialNet. I've been using OSINT Industries a lot recently, which I really like. Good old-fashioned Googling, although Google as a search, you will find many in my industry complaining about. It's gotten worse and worse. It's indexing less of the things that we're used to it indexing, like forums especially. And I will use also open sources like the Open Corporates, which indexes and catalogs a lot of corporate information, directors and officers of companies and where they're registered. I think those are kind of the ones I rely on the most.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rachel, so much for joining us. This has been an absolute treat. Always love picking your brain on certain things about the industry.
Sure.
And thanks to everyone for joining us.